Hi everyone, welcome to Toronto Data Workshop. Today's guest is Lars Vilhuber from Cornell. He's going to talk about privacy protection in RCTs. So Lars has a PhD in economics from University of Montreal, and he is faculty at Cornell University Economics Department. He is interested in labor economics, statistical disclosure limitation and data dissemination, but also reproducibility and replicability in social sciences. Of particular note, he's the data editor of the American Economic Association and managing editor of the Journal of Privacy and Confidentiality. And in those roles, he has made enormous contributions to how scientific economics is and is really setting it up to succeed over the next sort of few years with a lot of investments that are starting to pay off enormously. So thank you very much for joining us, Lars, and very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. I doubt that I'll be able to meet all those standards. Starting with my title slide where I forgot to update that it's June 2024 and not 23. So you can see that this project has been going on for a while. So this is a project that actually brings together multiple threads of which you mentioned there. The connection between data dissemination and privacy and confidentiality is a tricky one at the best of times, because we can only disseminate data that we know won't harm others, or at least that's what we try to do. And how to go about that is not always obvious. So I do remember a good colleague of mine at Cornell saying that European grants are all about you have to make your output open access, but then they ran surveys with people who are on the dole, and how do you make that open access? And you're given no guidance on some of that. So it's a hard problem. One of the things that then intersects with that is that if you actually want to have reproducibility in science, you kind of need to cross that axis again with the fact that others, even if you can't throw it over the wall onto the internet, must be able to somehow access, or at least be able to inspect and sort of reverse engineer what you're doing and saying, yeah, that seems sound to me, etc. So those threads come together in this paper. This came out of conversations with Sasha Slavkovich about this idea that privacy protection is hard. How do we go about making it easier? Where can we take something? Where can we take a smaller bite to sort of make incremental progress on this in some field? And that's where sort of we came upon this. Shuma and Aratrika are graduate students at this point in statistics at Penn State, and Sasha is a professor there. So it's an econ stats thing, but the data scientists here will also recognize some of this. So I already mentioned this. One of the key things that we sort of want to emphasize in every one of the replication packages that I manage for the various things is that it has stuff in it, right? So I need to be able to run something that is very close to the original data. And I'm already sort of caveating that by saying really close, because is it really the same or is it not? There are some journals, mine are not part of that group. There are some journals that actually require that if you can't provide the full data, you need to provide some fake data so that you can at least determine that the code runs given the fake data in a way that you claim has run for the actual original confidential data, right? So one of the reasons why we came upon RCTs is that they're a key part of the credibility revolution in economics. They're used not just in economics, they're used in many other domains as well. So we like to move towards causal inference by relying, when we can, on things that are at least somehow related to some randomized activity, in this case, randomized controlled trials, okay? The experimenter in these typically has a narrow focus. Okay, economists go all broad on these kinds of things, but there's a main effect of some treatment I'm doing, right? And that describes a huge swath of RCTs. Typically, you're going to say, okay, I've got some simple different groups. I'm going to compare across groups. So you're doing relatively simple effect variations, differences in means. You might adjust those means with some sort of things, etc. You might have stratification or blocking or other things. We're going to abstract away from this. but it sort of helps that we have this randomizer in there and generally relatively simple analysis methods. Now, privacy protection from my point of view is relatively poor in here. And this was the other trigger of this, was folks working at the Innovations in Poverty IPA, I forget what the A stands for, who reached out to me, having seen my work on some of these things in privacy protection, and said, what about low and middle income countries? People run lots of studies there. They publish then in the global north, and somehow it seems that we have observed that they don't always take as much care about the privacy of these people in the global south. Is that really true? It's an opinion. I'm not going to take a stance on that. But key fact is that regardless of where you look, privacy protection often just involves de-identification. That is something that you can reliably do. I'm going to strip off all the names. I'm going to not publish the geo coordinates of the house that I went to or things like that. And what am I going to do? I'm going to then maybe coarsen it a bit, etc. Right? So those methods are well understood. They're relatively simple, and they're also typically insufficient, because as soon as you get into some larger samples, you might get some problems with that kind of thing. And the study that we'll take for the example here today has a particular salient privacy concern that I'll get to in a moment. So why not use formal privacy methods? Okay, so take differential privacy, been around since 2009, lots and lots and lots of papers on it. Why is it not being implemented? Well, if you actually search for things that say, here's a DP regression method that actually provides you with the right inference tools and all of that, it's some very complex papers. And they're relatively new. And there is no off-the-rack Stata or R or MATLAB package that you can pick to choose those. And I say those three because nobody in econ uses Python. So what we set out to do is, can we find in this interspace where we're close enough to the simple analysis that are typically done in RCTs, where there is work in differential privacy on doing means comparison, regression models, protections in a certain way, right? So that DP can be applied. And once we do that, can inference survive, right? Or does it all become just so noisy that that 1,000 people sample that we had for the particular study now needs to be 100,000, and thus it won't happen, right? So we're going to try and maintain inference. If we glean from it that we will need a larger sample in order to have power to make the inferences that we'd like to be able to make, that, can we quantify if we need a larger sample? Do we go from 1,000 to 1,100, or do we go from 1,000 to 100,000? That's of material interest here. And finally, can we do it in a way that is, if not easy, at least computationally accessible to the type of studies that these guys have, right? So my impression from having looked at a lot of these RCTs in the field, especially in low and middle income countries, it's a laptop with a guy in the field, right? And he doesn't necessarily have access to, and it's mostly guys, so I'm just going to put that out there. So that term was specifically chosen, but it's mostly people with a laptop without necessarily access to big computing resources, etc. So those are the three goals. We still want to publish data. We still want to maintain inference closely enough, and we want to do so in a relatively feasible manner. Now, I'm going to say, you saw that this started in 23. We're not there yet. In particular, we haven't, that last part about easily accessible. Currently, the code is a mess, so that's definitely not easily accessible. But also, how long does the code actually run to do a simple regression that runs in seconds on a laptop is something that we actually still have to quantify. So you're not going to see methods on that today. That's still in progress. Okay. One of our initial hopes that we're not entirely sure, and you can sort of get into conversations about what are we actually trying to protect, is the idea of privacy amplifying methods through sampling that are out there in the literature. Do those apply here? I don't think we've come to a complete agreement on that yet. Okay, so we're going to make it real. We started out real. I mentioned that most methods right now are just de-identification. Well, that plays at least into our research goal, because then we actually have actual data that we can work on protecting. The elements that they stripped off, the names, etc., are typically not relevant. The rest of the stuff is the raw, unprotected data. So if that is the true inference, we can now play around with that original data and say, what if we do something to it? Does the original analysis still yield similar results? Okay, and once we do that, can we release the protected data as part of a replication package that others can run? And what do they get when they do that? Do they still think, yeah, this seems reasonable, and all those kinds of things? So we have a whole thing about the data structure setup. There's a data out there. The key thing about that is we've got treatment T and some other covariates X. So we are going to address it in a straight up regression framework. We're going to ignore the blocking variables right now. We think that that is a simple extension from what we're doing here, but we haven't played it all out. The covariates are sensitive. These are the demographics of the people who have participated in your study, right? So they'll have age, they'll have education, they'll have information about this kind of stuff. In this particular study, they'll have information about your drug use, your drug dealing, your alcohol consumption, whether you have guns, whether you've shot somebody, etc. Seems kind of sensitive, and so we might want to protect that, right? We are actually interested in the treatment effects, though. Right, so we're going to offer these individuals treatment, or rather the original authors offered these individuals treatment. And the controls are just there to take into account a bit of the heterogeneity that goes beyond the random assignment part, okay? So the key thing is that normally these models rely heavily on the randomization. As long as your balance across the two groups is relatively good, you don't actually need to worry that much about the covariates, and this is primarily there as a control. That buys us that we don't, if the inference isn't sensitive to the covariates because both groups are relatively similar, then modifying those things in a way that protects them should also, if done right, not get in the way of inference too strongly either. So that's sort of the idea here. So the first focus here is on the statistical utility of what we're doing. Inference concerning those fixed effects, our treatment that we're doing, should be affected as little as possible by whatever data release mechanism we're going to come up with, right? We should still be able to get to the same observation. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a synthetic data frame of the same size as the original data, that satisfies, in this case, epsilon. I think we've expanded since then to epsilon delta differential privacy. I'm not the DP expert here, so I'll defer those questions to my co-authors who are not here. But here's the trick. I can't call it synthetic data because that means I'm not actually releasing protected data. So I'm going to call it protected data. So we're trying to be as close as possible to what the statistics say, but also this should be sellable to economists who might want to think about, yeah, sure, I want to protect my data, but no, I don't want to create synthetic data. When in fact, that turns out to be more or less equivalent in the sort of statistical computer science world, okay? One key assumption that we're going to take as part of what we're looking for is that releasing those treatment effects is actually safe. Okay? So we actually want to know whether that treatment actually works. And so we don't care about the demographics. So we can mess with those as much as possible, but we actually care that whatever treatment we're providing here is working. And that means that the effect of that on the respondents in whatever metrics we're going to have are going to be releasable. Now, whether or not that actually means that releasing estimates of these tau is safe is a different question, and I think opinions will differ on that and have, according to the referee reports we got, differ substantially on that. So everybody probably would agree that releasing what the effect of a particular treatment in the population is fine, because ultimately that's the statistical element that you want to tease out and then apply grossly. Smoking brings you closer to death than not smoking. That's the statistical inference. But the actual estimates are going to be a function of the people who participated and their data. And so there's some ambiguity about whether or not what we're going to do here in this first draft, where we do a hybrid model, is going to be sufficient. So that's what we've been working on in our revision.
Lars, just to follow up on the smoking example. So what you're not sure about is whether you're allowed to say how many years smoking takes off your life. Is that?
No, it's more subtle than that.
It's more subtle, right?
So smoking is not good. Smoking takes X years off your life. All of those are statistical inferences that emanate from that primary conclusion, right? What is not clear, and this is a mathematical point that privacy experts have sort of brought up, is that our estimate of that is right purely mechanically is a function of the X's in that group, right? So that's not a population parameter, it's an estimate of the population parameter, and we're trying to protect the X's without protecting the actual population inference. So we still want to do the population inference, but the actual released estimate of that does contain or is a function of the data of the respondents. Now we're going to address part of that here, but I'll get to why that might be a weakness in this hybrid mechanism in a moment. Okay.
Thank you.
So the key mechanism we're going to use is very straight up differential privacy. Think simply of all of your X's and the values that they take mapped into a multivariate histogram. So within your, in this case, 1,000 people, we're just going to construct the number of bins that correspond to the observed values in the data. We're going to count how many people are in those bins, and that gives us a vector of counts. And to that, we're going to add Laplace noise. That's pretty much textbook differential privacy. That's already not easy to do in real life, right? And that's why there's many refinements of this, because this is now a data set that has that is as large as the number of covariates times each of their values. It's not a function of the number of people in your database. And that can quickly become very big depending on how they are, right? So as part of what we do here practically in the example, we actually discretize some of the continuous variables that are in the data set. And so now we have bins for that, and that allows us to limit how big that histogram has to become, right? But in the practical example, we actually couldn't push it to do all of the covariates that we had, simply because it started to become very unwieldy. And this is where sort of applying these simple methods then quickly becomes customizing methods. Our goal was to stick to relatively standard methods, so to make it easier for implementation. So we are already in that conundrum, okay? So once we've added the Laplace noise to it, we're going to create a synthetic X. We're going to just sample again in that histogram, right? And we're going to get out from that a population that looks pretty similar, but is now fully DP by what we want to achieve, right? So that's the sanitized data frame. We actually then rerun to some extent the experiment again. So we don't actually preserve any of the original treatment assignments. We just literally reapply the algorithm. And that's why this is nice in RCTs. It's an algorithm. We just randomly assign these again. And if there's blocking variables that go into this, they probably would have then be part of the histogram, but you can formulate the same thing to it. So we're going to assign our synthetic population into the buckets again that the original experiment ran. Okay, so that's our synthetic data frame with assignment indicators. And then we're going to use the privately estimated, the confidential beta that includes the taus that are the actual estimates from this population. And we're going to construct imputed outcome variables using the privately computed parameters, but the synthetic population. Okay. So that's where it becomes critical. How much do we care about those taus? Because those are now being passed through this as the ones estimated with the noise that comes from estimating it in the sample, but that's the population noise. We're using the original taus to compute these synthetic outcome variables based on the synthetic population, right? And so this is where the referees have correctly stated that while we're not publishing the actual X's of the respondents in this mechanism, they are leaking through the taus because they factor into that estimation. right? And so now you have to make a choice. Is publishing 9 statistics out of all the parameters that went into this, the dimensionality of that, is that a problem or not? We're not taking a stance here, is that good or not? It's a choice the researcher will have to make together with their IRB and other things as well, okay? So now, once we've done that, we can release the full data set that has everything protected through this hybrid mechanism. And we can now estimate the parameters of interest on the publicly available protected data. And whether or not we actually publish the original betas, which include the taus, or the protected ones, is then again a question that we can get into. And I'll defer some of that to questions later on, because we actually have some evidence for models where you don't know whether or not you are actually close to the real parameters. There, researchers are really, really hesitant to do that. And I can relate to some of the experience we've had doing that in the past. Here, the researcher has a hold of both the confidential data and the protected data, and so they can make those assessments. Okay, proofs, workflow. Here's the confidential area, but we're going to put out these things. That's the same thing I just explained. And now we're going to assess how well that works. We're going to take a real example in a moment. So we have the somewhat by now traditional confidence interval overlap indicator. Is there overlap and how much overlap is there? And the coverage by that indicator as well. Yeah, and so here's again the confidence interval overlap. Metric 1 is simply, is there overlap? And this is the percentage overlap. Okay. And I'm not going to go on this measure that we use here too much. It's the squared error in the estimates that we're getting. We're taking that as a measure of, we actually want to distort that. So the higher this is, the better protected the data are. But at the same time, it's a measure that is sort of tricky to get. And we didn't do this. Sorry, no, the empirical squared error is our measure of how good we were. Okay, let me cut to the chase to the paper. We're taking a paper in the journals that I'm responsible for, but from before the time that I was responsible for it, from 2017. It's cognitive behavioral therapy applied in Liberia to criminally engaged men, mostly young men. And the outcome measures are, does this reduce crime and violence? Okay. So the key program impacts are already summarized in table 2 of the paper. This is the original table 2. I don't want you to sort of stare at this, but the key thing is that they had therapy only, cash only, and both as sort of treatment effects there. They had a control mean as well. And then you get the various impacts at both an aggregate measure of various antisocial behaviors. Do you still sell drugs? How many robberies have you conducted in the last 2 weeks? How many fights have you been in the last 2 weeks, etc.? Definitely the kind of thing that you want to just publish on the internet about anybody. And then there's a 12 to 13 month impact, the long-term impact of these kinds of things. Okay. So there's various things that you can immediately think about. If I'm asking you about all these kinds of behaviors, you might not actually want the police or your gang members to know that you were actually in the sample and what the measures were, right? Oh, what do you mean you did 2 robberies last week? You didn't give us your share of that, might be what your gang members say. Or they might say, hey, you're in the cash only one. You actually got serious money. Let me have a bit of that, right? And so this is just, it seems a bit easy speaking, but this is just very salient about what it is in the database of all the demographic characters that might allow you to re-identify somebody, and then figure out that they actually participate in this by itself might be interesting to others as well. So privacy is clearly, in this case, salient, right? What are we interested in? There is not, and this is why this is not atypical of econ ones, there isn't a single number we're after, right? Cortisol has this effect on the body. Exactly, right? There's a slew of various factors out there. And so this is going to be a somewhat more holistic description, right? In a nutshell, panel B is the one that we focused on. And really, there is only an effect, a strong effect somewhat strong effect of giving both therapy and money. Right? One or the other doesn't necessarily work. And you can see that if there is any statistical evidence, the bold numbers here, it's in this rightmost column where they got both. Okay, so that's sort of what the authors found. And so let's start with what's just one part of that. That z-score is what we started out as a target, right? So takeaway from that is it doesn't work in cash only, it doesn't work in treatment only, but it works if you give it to both. Okay. Here's our outcome variables, right? So there's the treatment effects. We have age. We have indicators of whether or not you sold various drugs. And this is just a subset of the variables that are on the data set, but these are the ones that we actually then worked with, right? And this more or less is the outcome, right? So, sorry about the figure, we still have managed to jigger those so that it's somewhat easier. But essentially, once we've done this hybrid mechanism, the dots as well as the confidence bands on each of these are on top of each other, more or less similar. The DP synthetic is the blue. Here it's a bit lower. The confidence intervals, the way that we computed them, is about the same size, but the confidence, the point estimates are all somewhat lower, but none of the primary conclusions of the article actually change for this. Okay, so our primary goal was not to get the point estimates right. That's by definition truly hard or impossible. We wanted to get the basic inference, what works, what does not, right here. Okay. Now, caveats here, we did not estimate corrected confidence intervals that take into the account that there's actually additional noise coming through this. So these are just confidence intervals coming straight out of the OLS, a naive confidence interval, if you like. So these conclusions might still change a bit. So for any given data set, M is the original one. And then we also tried something where we actually did not apply much noise to it, but we did apply the sampling in the data set. So the protection here comes purely from sampling in the original histogram without any added noise. That actually, as you might imagine, just made the X's noisier and essentially toned down some of the things here. So the protected one happens to be better here than the purely synthetic one. Okay. In terms of the metrics, metric one, there always is overlap. As you saw, that's not a chance. It also scales up to many of the other variables. There always is some overlap of the confidence interval. So good to know, not particularly salient. Many of the others exhibit fairly good numbers as well. Higher is better for these. Lower is better for these because the actual point estimate variation is relatively low. So it all looks pretty good. Hold on. Okay, so yeah, we did this with epsilon of 0.1. We did it with an epsilon of 0.5. And an epsilon of 1, right? So while some of these numbers jiggle around, the basic conclusions don't actually change. When we say non-DP, this is the purely synthetic one where we just literally create the histogram, sample back from it, but inject no noise. You can see that the metric 4 is even lower in many cases, but many of the other things are there as well. This tells us that much of the noise comes from the resampling and not necessarily from the noise injection. That's not particularly useful at this point, but it does tell us that there might be improvements there by how we actually do the construction of the protected data set, because it's not the noise that's contributing that we inject to it that is the problem. It's the actual noise that comes from the resampling in the data set part. At least that's what we take away from it. And just to sort of illustrate this mean squared error of a particular variable, age is one of the protected variables, so that's the one we focused on. So the mean squared error on those variables is relatively invariant to the choice of epsilon, but if you don't perturb it at all, then you get very low protection, and that's also what was the intent of that exercise. Okay, so as I mentioned, and I'll open up the floor then to questions and other paths that we might take from that. The one key thing that the referees didn't like is that there is leakage of privacy coming through the estimated white tilde, because that comes through the taus that are not protected. And so applying a fully differentially private estimation method or protection method for this, where we're even protecting the taus that come out of this, is something that we've been working on. We have completed it, but not in time to write this up. I need to pull out various threads from 4 co-authors who are working in 3 repositories and have not synchronized any time recently. One of the key aspects of this is that it makes the whole process way more complicated. Of course, we could hide some of that away in functions and packages and things like that, but it also requires substantial more computational costs. So we were not able to do any of this even remotely on a laptop. This was run on the high-performance computer cluster at Penn State. How much longer than on the typical laptop it would have taken is something that I still need to capture. So we're going to rerun this, fully reproducibility and all that stuff. So that's still on our path of doing so. So the computational challenge will be, how can we make this become accessible to the researcher in the field? We're not going to solve that for this paper, but it's, I think, an important part in making these methods more acceptable is that they actually need to run in some sort of what for the typical researcher is finite time. The other restriction, we're not going to solve that here, but the number of variables that we have protected is only a subset of the original analysis. It doesn't matter that much for the inference, which of course is interesting. So before we actually started, we did actually a replication of the original paper with a reduced set of variables just to figure out if the authors had used just this reduced set of variables, would they have come to the similar conclusion? The answer is yes, they would have. And from that point on, we started that as the baseline. So we're not actually comparing ourselves to the original paper and all the metrics. We're comparing it to the reduced variable estimate. But that one in and of itself is close enough to the original one. But that's nice in this particular example. That might not work in others, right? And then, of course, we focused on this first line, or rather down here, panel B, this first line, and created a custom synthetic data set because our Ys are imputed conditional on the model that we're estimating, right? But every single one of these rows is a separate regression with a separate dependent variable. In the original sense, we're using one data set and running 18 regressions. Do we have 18 data sets that correspond to each one of these regressions, or how do we address the fact that we've got multiple outcome variables that all need to be potentially simultaneously protected? And there, I truly don't know how to address that at this point, other than we're going to have multiple data sets, and that is confusing again, of course. And so we're going to need to figure out how we want to address that in some future work, or open to suggestion ideas around that. And the other thing that we're working on, graduate students have this thing that they tend to move on with life and careers and other things. So we're working with some additional students now to expand, to see if we can scale this up and run this on multiple RCTs using our, if you like, custom off-the-rack method, but using the same method over and over again, and see what kind of results we get from that. So is there hope for canned packages that have a limited set of options that you can choose from? Is that something we can come up with? That's the long-term goal. Finally, we're not going to be publishing the confidential data here. We didn't just strip off some variables that are irrelevant, we messed with the data wholesale. So will other researchers believe us when we say we've applied the package of Mukherjee et al. To our data? Here's the modified data. We're not going to give you the original data, remains a question, right? I handle that daily in my job as a data editor. So one of the ways around that is to often have privately accessible data. Can somebody still go through the full process, get temporary access to the privacy sensitive data, apply the differential privacy mechanism to it and say, yep, it does produce the file that they claim they produced, and we're good for that. So that may also be necessary. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it does mean that more users can focus on what the analysis did, which is probably their primary concern. And a few key, maybe trustworthy, whatever that word might mean in that context, users can say, and yes, the protection mechanism actually did what they claim it did, and they didn't fudge with it in some other way and construct a synthetic data set that just happens to support their hypothesis. So we can handle that possibly separately. And as I mentioned to Rowan before we started the call, we actually have some work on how you might go about that down the road, but that's not ready for publication now. So I'll stop there and open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Lars. That's a fantastic topic, very important. Are there any questions? If folks would like to raise their hands, just to get us started, are you able to talk a little bit about what happens at the moment? And like, what are the options right now? And I can see how your option adds to that, but what are people doing right now in terms of the RCTs?
They're pretty much doing what I outlined earlier on, is that they're applying best practice, and I cite a few works out there from various institutions. They're applying best practice, de-identification. Maybe they're coarsening some things. I do remember that, say, the DHS surveys that have household surveys from around the world coarsen or noise infuse some of the geo coordinates in a specific way, so that, you know, you add some noise to the GPS coordinates, but control that they're still going to be within the same county, province, whatever, or something like that. As soon as you put boundaries on it, you are reversible and not perfect. So all of those things are critical. That's kind of what's done right now. Some of the data just isn't made available in its identified form at all, and sometimes the data isn't made available at all. So I just got a response from an Indian survey where they said, well, you put into the consent agreement to the users that you're not going to share it with anybody else, so you can't share it with Lars, even if he promises not to publish it. And so that also is out there, and that transparency then says we're going to say that that's the case, but there's no fix for that. If you agreed to not share the data forever, then you are not going to be sharing the data ever. And that's just going to be it. And then if we want to publish that data or not is an editorial decision. Mostly in economics, we publish those papers, but there certainly are journals who say, if you can't make the data available, then you can't publish. And honestly, I have no idea what the journals that say that will say to data that has been protected. If I call it synthetic data, they're going to say, well, but you're not publishing the real data. If I call it protected data, oh, you're good, you did the right thing, right? And so there it's a matter also of educating editors and journal managers and things like that about what it actually means to publish protected data.
Yeah, and certainly norms are changing fairly quickly. Are there any questions from anyone? Feel free to raise your hand. In terms of operationalizing this, do you think that you need something that works on your laptop, on the user's laptop, or do you think that a situation where I upload my data set to the cloud, it runs on Penn State system, and then I can download a protected version? Do you think that would be acceptable in terms of the norms that exist?
Probably. You can actually measure how acceptable that is, because Dataverse has had some mechanisms embedded in the Harvard Dataverse that are differentially private. I think they call it 2Raven. It's been there for years. So who's aware of it? Who's using it? Right. So part of this is understanding as well and disseminating outside of a relatively narrow computer science / statistics community about what it actually means to do these more sophisticated and more thorough privacy protection mechanisms. I mean, if I'm going to say I'm going to coarsen my data because I want to protect the privacy and all the analysis still holds, that's fine. If I inject noise and all the analysis still holds, many people will say that's not fine because now you messed with the data. Coarsening is not viewed the same way as injecting noise, and yet statistically, injecting noise is way better. Because, I mean, one of the ways you decoarsen data that has been coarsened is you sample from it, and you're injecting noise into it in that sense to redo it. So there is a perception issue of that. And then there are the issues of, it's, if this is hard for 7 variables, imagine the PSID with 1200, right?
Rohan, can I ask a question? Excuse me for my language because it's a second language for me. And thank you for your conversation about the speech. I want to ask you about, did you consider about correlation between data in this model? Did you find any method for consider about the correlations?
So one of the beauties I always find of using the multidimensional histogram is that it's non-parametric and thus doesn't impose any structure on the correlation, but by just adding okay, Rowan is going to correct me on that. I'm not a statistician, but it's pretty non-parametric on that. So just adding noise to it does a pretty good job of preserving most of those correlations within the data set. There are other methods of creating synthetic data that are more model-based, and they impose essentially constraints on the various correlations that are in the data set, essentially back to the model. So the X's being derived from that multivariate histogram are, we didn't test for it, but is by design preserving most of those correlations. The Y's are not, right? And that's kind of what I alluded to at the end, is that as soon as we oppose a model to impute the Y's, we are restricting what is correlated with what in what way. Because we're saying it's only going to be through this mechanism of a standard linear regression model. If you want something more complicated, for instance, if there are blocking variables, then you have to take those into account in the model, and only if you take it into account in the model will the synthetic data also preserve those.
Yes, thank you.
Annie?
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk, Lars. It was really interesting. You identified sort of the two bigger blockers for implementation being the sort of computational power required to do this sort of thing, and also the education component in terms of getting journals to adopt this. I'm curious as to which you think is the biggest blocker for wide-scale acceptance of differentially private data in this context. Like, do you think they go hand in hand, or do you think one is going to be overcome first, or can be overcome first?
I would argue that probably the educational part of teaching people about this is going to be the harder one. The computational part, like Rowan said, would somebody, can we throw up something that leverages, say, Compute Canada's net or some of the National Science Foundation, the US nets, just computing cycles for this kind of stuff in the overall scheme of things are pretty small. It's just that they surpass what goes on local computers, which still is what the key paradigm is, but that's a teachable moment. People do use high performance computing, and so if you give them something to upload to and say it comes back protected, and I trust that mechanism, I don't think that that's a core problem. It might still be with what instigated this line of research, namely, how does that look in low and middle income countries? But I'm also relatively confident that over time, say GPU-based methods, and every laptop has some sort of GPU, and no, it's not particularly powerful, but maybe for this, we can leverage that to, have these things run even on a laptop GPU, and it'll be better than trying to run on the CPU of a laptop or things like that. Those things undoubtedly will emerge at some point. It's not like people have been expanding how many questions they ask of a human in a survey. So the constraining factor being the number of variables, the covariates on a data set, etc., in the social world isn't expanding vastly. Now, if you add to that maybe you're getting some DNA stuff and other environmentals out of it, then yes, of course, that's expanding as well. But I don't think all those computational aspects, which dimension you're expanding here, is the key. I think the educational part about that you should be doing this is critical. Now, I should say, those are also, there's bottlenecks in that, or choke points, if you like. A lot of people get their education about what, at least in the world that I'm in, what mechanism they should apply if they find it in a JPAL or World Bank manual or something like that. And part of the key outreach is also making it easy to sort of say, yeah, sure, you're going to need to upload it to this, but the World Bank or JPAL said, yes, that this is a good thing. And all of a sudden you get lots and lots of acceptance. So there are keys to unlocking that problem. They're not going to happen overnight. But if you get into at least one of the sub-communities, you can make progress there.
And I guess sort of a follow-up question, if that's okay. Do you think it will, you mentioned the sort of having a few trustworthy people with access to the actual data to sort of verify and give a thumbs up. Do you think, now that you've mentioned the sort of World Bank big actors, sort of an endorsement on that front, do you think it will, do you think that's a necessary part of this process, the sort of large scale institutional acceptance for this to be accepted more widespread? Or do you think there is progress to be made at the sort of smaller scale peer review or endorsement on a trustworthy individual level?
It has to come, this is a broader conversation, but it has to come at multiple levels is sort of my take on it. It helps when some of the big guys start doing similar things, but they can't be the only ones who designate this as this is the good way to good. The World Bank won't run that server that you upload things to, that you can upload your RCT stuff, etc. They might provide something like it as a service for collaborating teams or something like that, but it has to be broader than that. I mean, in the other project that that I mentioned, we are working on essentially a network of trust that leverages trust where trust is, to then have mechanisms that say this is actually what ran without making any inference about what ran, right? So if I give you, here's this complicated thing, it has to run on a high performance computing system, input confidential data that I can't give you, output protected data that I can give you. If you have trust that that entire chain is there, it was run, the algorithm has been peer reviewed. So now my only qualm is, do I trust that Rowan ran it, or maybe fiddled with his computer in doing so that you get the illusion that it was the case? Or how can we increase the trust in that stream of processing? Now, University of Toronto, if Rowan delegated it to the University of Toronto, they might be less willing to fudge it for Rowan's sake, because they've got hundreds of other researchers there which rely on that trust too. So we can somehow delegate to the institution, your institution, not some one big institution, this idea of, yes, we certify that what Rowan ran actually ran the way that he claims it runs. Then we can leverage that. And now we have a multiplier to the thousands of universities or research institutions or etc. Right? And that doesn't always work, right? A commercial entity might not have the credibility to say, yes, we do that, but they also have more at stake. So while it's not perfect, it might still be sufficient to do so, right? The World Bank is running reproducibility checks on the papers of people who are associated with the World Bank. Does the World Bank have an interest in some of the conclusions that come out of those studies? Yes. Can anybody else access the data? No. So, you know, second best. The institution is saying that at least we're putting the same kind of trust behind this guy than to this other guy. And if we're going to compromise for this guy, we're going to impede all the other ones. And we've been down that road with the World Bank, which is why I'm bringing that up in terms of credibility of studies that bias towards certain conclusions. And it affects everybody and is not often repeated because of that.
So that makes sense. Thanks very much.
If anyone has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. Lars, to use the econ terminology, and please correct me where I'm wrong, I think that what you're going to be ensuring, or like getting us closer to, is going to be computational reproducible results, basically, because now you would have data that comes with it, and it's, you know, it's data that somebody has said is reasonable, and you can now publish the data alongside your RCT analysis, so that's good, right? And then what you would be giving up would be a robustness of results. Is that Is that a correct way of thinking about it? Or?
You're limiting where robustness of results can be assessed, right? Since you, and like I said, part of it is because the Ys depend on the model that was used to generate them in this particular algorithm. So you can fiddle around with that within that model world and question whether some things are still robust when you run the analysis on the protected data, right? But you can't get around the fact that now you've wiped some things from it. Margin's point about the correlation, some of those are now gone. And so you can't necessarily swap in other variables or things like that, or use a different model to figure out whether that is doing. In some of our stuff, we actually did the imputation not using the same model and actually achieved better analytic validity. So instead of using straight up linear regression, we used some logistic regressions or logit models to do some of the things and actually got better performance out of that, even when the final analysis was still back with a regression model. But that's not like radically different. It's a different link function, but it's not a radically different analysis model that you're thinking of. So you are limiting it to some extent on that. So it also means that reuse of the data for other purposes is going to be limited, right? So yes, you can fiddle around with the robustness of the analysis within certain dimensions, but you can't go and use the data for something completely different. A different way of thinking about it, different analysis model, etc. So I kind of think that that's not typically what we do anyway with many of these things. So people tend to reuse it where it's congenial to the original purpose to use it that way, even possibly decades later. So I have no idea whether that's a big constraint or not.
Yeah, especially in an RCT world, right, where we're asking specific questions, we're answering specific questions. And...
Part of why we started with that, right? Because we don't have to address the general utility. We have to address it in the context of the RCT that was run, which is mostly run the test, figure it out, then we're done, and we go on to the next one that replicates it but collects new data and things like that, right?
Yeah, it's a different beast to like a census or different.
So let's put it this way. It might make it more transparent to say these results are relatively robust, and it's worthwhile to start the replication exercise rather than not having any confidence at all in this. And so that is a benefit. But yes, it does limit some of the things that we do.
Are there any other questions from folks out there? Let's just then, with the final couple of minutes, could you take a minute or two to sort of talk about what some of the challenges that you see on the horizon? And maybe more broadly, you know, what do you wish that people were working on in this space? You've got limited hours in the day. What would be your wish list?
Take some computing classes. Just make whatever you're doing computationally better. So I have this wish project where I'd like to look into the productivity function that we are, right? How efficient are we at actually producing new science? And in the world that I am, I see all the inefficiencies that come from poor programming practices that multiply throughout the life cycle of a project, because they're not getting that much better if they're that bad at the end. Who knows where they started, but so just making your own research more efficient allows anybody, whatever they think to be important, to do more of it and thus generate more science.
Right. And on that note, we might just say thank you once again for a fantastic presentation, Lars. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Hope everyone else has a nice rest of the day. Bye, everyone.